Shadow Hack. Chapter 501 Successful Congealing. Now I also possess it. After receiving the system's reminder, Li Yunmu immediately regained his calm. He bit his finger and sent a drop of blood with all his might toward the incomplete expert armor hovering in the sky. At the same time, he began to chant the incantation which was the final step for congealing the expert armor. Be successful for me. A drop of concentrated blood essence entered the expert armor. It was followed by Li Yunmu chanting the incantation. Instantly, the sky of the heavenly world which was filled with the roar of the Azure Dragon's Holy Spirit went silent. Red light had shot out from the expert armor and forcibly dragged the Holy Spirit inside with it. Fortunately, Host had only assimilated 3 parts of Azure Dragon deity suit. If it had been all 5 parts, then the success would have been unlikely, the system suddenly said. What about now? How is it? Li Yunmu couldn't care less about might-have-beens. In his eyes, there was only one matter in the world: whether the legendary innate expert armor was successfully manufactured or not. Congratulations, Host, the innate expert armor has been successfully completed. Requesting you to give it a name. The system's voice, filled with faint excitement, echoed in his ears. Successful? Is it really successful? Li Yunmu was greatly shaken. Although he had heard the system's positive confirmation, he still felt like it was unreal. He who was an outsider descender had actually manufactured the innate expert armor which not even one among a million might possess? This was simply unfathomable. Even he himself was unable to believe it, and his heart began to leap with joy. He suddenly let out his spiritual awareness. Once he did so, he immediately calmed down. With a single thought, he could vividly sense the existence of the innate expert armor which had assimilated with his bloodline. Even if one closed their eyes, or even if all of the 5 senses were sealed, the existence of the innate expert armor would still be like a lamp flickering in the darkness. He could sense it clearly. Armor, come. Li Yunmu couldn't control his ecstasy. He waved toward the distant innate expert armor still emitting the green light, and it quickly returned to him. He watched as it came with runes as well as silver stars and golden wires covering its form. Crackling sound echoed in the place, and Li Yunmu was covered in the innate expert armor. He felt like a future soldier wearing an armor which was emitting green flames. It was an extremely pleasant sensation. Innate expert armor, so this is the legendary innate expert armor. This sort of sensation is too invigorating. Li Yunmu stretched his arm forward, and a torrent of green flames rushed out from his hand. The moment he aimed his thoughts at them, the flames changed shape. The majestic flux energy fluctuation in them could cause anyone's heart to palpitate. From now on, you will be called Azure Dragon Expert Armor. Li Yunmu didn't want to think much about it and sealed the deal by giving a simple name to the expert armor. When he was on Earth, he had been bestowed the title of Azure Dragon General by the Central Continent's King City. Later, he'd had the opportunity to collect 3 pieces of Azure Dragon deity suit. From that, it seemed like the name Azure Dragon was fated with him, so he might as well use IR for the expert armor. It also implied that there will no longer be an Azure Dragon deity suit in this world anymore. In its place, there would come a more formidable Azure Dragon expert armor. This was an innate expert armor which could mature and evolve because it possessed boundless potential. At this time, Li Yunmu was completely calm. He was carefully sensing the properties and abilities of his expert armor. Or well, he was calm until he tried the armor on. The moment it was on him, he was left stunned. Formidable, the legendary innate expert armor is simply too formidable. The basic congealed armor provided an amplification of 10% 30%, opulent congealed armor provided 30% 50%, while treasure congealed armor provided an amplification of 50% 100%. Then what about the legendary innate expert armor? Sadly, there was no recorded data about the precise amplification. The reason behind it? Because the people who were in possession of such armor were extremely few in number. Otherwise, why would it be known as the armor possessed only by 1 in a million? Although there would still be quite some people who had congealed it, they wouldn't exceed several hundred in the whole world. After all, the estimate of 1 in a million was just a conservative estimate. The odds of successfully congealing an innate expert armor were simply too low. Even if one possessed the resources and background, it didn't mean that they would also possess the luck and ability to calculate with extreme precision. From a certain point of view, the main factor behind Lee Yun-mu's success was the system's assistance. Otherwise, even if he had collected all the materials successfully, he may not have been able to complete the congealing process without any error. Because of these factors, the actual number of cultivators who possessed innate expert armor was far smaller than it was rumored. In reality, there was no cultivator who possessed the innate expert armor and would be willing to reveal its abilities and effects. Only a few instances of data didn't provide a clear picture of the amplification numbers. System, you had gathered some data. What was the flux energy amplification of those people? Lee Yun-mu suddenly asked with a monstrous expression. The system had gathered data on 7 cultivators who possessed innate expert armor. The flux energy amplification in them is divided as follows: 160%, 170%, 170%, 170%, 190%, 210%, 210%. Taking an average, the approximate flux energy amplification is around 180%, the system quickly responded. When Lee Yun-mu heard it, he turned silent. Is it low? The system asked with some curiosity. It's not. In fact, it's high to the extent that I cannot believe it, Lee Yun-mu sincerely replied with a stupefied expression. 250%. The system quickly made some calculations and voiced a reasonable value. No, it is 290%. Lee Yun-mu said in a gruff voice. The system was startled for a moment, then said, "Congratulations, host. The innate expert armor congealed by you is probably the closest to the legendary deity-grade innate expert armor." Given its accurate calculations, it had estimated the flux energy of Lee Yun-mu's innate expert armor to be from 200% to 250%. However, it showed up that there was definitely 1 or maybe even 2 or more materials used by Lee Yun-mu which had surpassed the system's expectations and resulted in a mistake in its calculations. Deity-grade innate expert armor. Lee Yun-mu had never heard of this 5th type of expert armor, and it was the first time that the system had mentioned it. That's right. The system had seen mention in some ancient book that 4,600 years ago, there was a powerhouse who had congealed an innate expert armor in his youth. Its flux energy amplification had been 300%. 300%. Lee Yun-mu lost his voice. Although his innate expert armor had already attained an amplification of 290%, which was close to 3 times the amplification, the difference of 10% was still a difference of 10%. Somehow, an innate expert armor with an even more formidable amplification rate than his existed. The innate expert armor considered as an unattainable goal by the majority of flux experts apparently still had grades. And one of them was even known as deity-grade innate expert armor. This was simply bullshit. Yes, it possessed an amplification of 300%. But since then, no one has been able to create a similar one. Therefore, it was considered as deity-grade innate expert armor by the later generations. In fact, after so many years, almost no one even knows about it. Then the innate expert armor which I possess now, isn't it incomparably close to deity tier? Chapter 502 Spirits of Protection and Slaughter. Lee Yun-mu hadn't expected he would not only congeal the innate expert armor without any problems, but that its flux energy amplification would also be extremely close to the legendary deity-grade innate expert armor. According to the system's words, there had only been 1 legendary deity-grade innate expert armor in the history of the origin world. However, it had disappeared more than 4,000 years ago. Thinking like that, wasn't the innate expert armor congealed by him the peak existence among all the innate expert armors existing at the moment? Once he thought about it, Li Yunmyu couldn't help but feel his blood boil. Given that his flux energy strength already far surpassed ordinary cultivators by reaching 900 units, how much would it become if it was multiplied 2.9 times? He was still fine before he calculated it, but once he figured out the number, Li Yunmyu felt his head spin. The dizziness didn't come from fear, but instead extreme happiness. 3,500 flux energy points was truly too outrageous, to the point of astonishing people. If the flux energy strength of a cultivator who had cultivated all the 108 flux points was 300 units, then if they congealed a treasure armor which was conventionally considered as the highest grade armor, their flux energy would be amplified by 100%. But even then, the similar level cultivator's flux energy strength after amplification would only attain 600 points. Yet after adorning Azure Dragon Expert Armor, Li Yunmyu's flux energy strength reached 3,500 points, which was easily 2,900 points higher than the other party. Li Yunmyu instantly felt a great change take place in his mind. For instance, the most elite cultivators of the origin world on the same layer who had reached perfect great circle and had congealed treasure armor would be much more formidable than those who had congealed basic or opulent armor. But even when compared to those most remarkable cultivators at the same level, Li Yunmyu still surpassed them by 2,900 points. Once he got this result, he felt that he had gone stupid. Had his strength truly made such an enormous jump because of successfully congealing innate expert armor? Although the answer didn't seem real, it was indeed true. Host must not find it bizarre, after all. Your flux energy strength was already 3 times that of other cultivators in Great Circle. Now, after obtaining the innate expert armor which is extremely close to deity grade, your strength had increased greatly once more. This is actually absolutely normal. The system spoke in its usual calm and collected tone. But Li Yunmyu knew that the wretched system was definitely pretending. In other words, I am unequaled among the people of the same cultivation, Li Yunmyu mumbled to himself, but this time, his tone didn't contain any doubt, but was filled with absolute certainty. In front of your strength, they are like children in front of adults. Even if the other party possesses similar innate expert armor, they would still be unable to compare to your present strength. Soon, the system presented a new comparison in Li Yunmyu's mind. It chose the most formidable cultivator on the same cultivation layer in the origin world. It was a person who had reached the Great Circle, filled all the 108 point, and also possessed an innate expert armor which provided flux energy amplification of 250%. This hypothetical opponent would possess a flux energy strength of 1050 units, which was the most formidable opponent the system could form with its data. Yet Li Yunmyu still far surpassed the other party, possessing offensive strength close to 2.5 times higher. How terrifying was this disparity! Imagine an ordinary person who possessed the strength of 100 kilograms. Compare then the disparity between them and the world's heavyweight boxing champion who could casually produce the strength of 350 kilograms with one punch. Although the ordinary person would be considered as powerful under normal circumstances, but compared to the champion, he would just be asking for a thrashing. And the difference between Li Yunmyu and the other cultivators on the same layer was even more enormous. Li Yunmyu was absolutely unparalleled among the cultivators on the same level. But this didn't mean that the congealing process was finished. Once Azure Dragon Expert Armor had been manufactured, the increase in his strength wasn't limited to just that. After all, his expert armor made his defense, which was already extremely formidable, to become even more frightening. With the 12 Light King crystal armor as the base on which the Black Ghost King armor and the 3 parts of Azure Dragon deity suit were added along with a large amount of sacred steel produced on the bed of the ocean, it wouldn't be the slightest exaggeration to say that Li Yunmyu's armor did more than just increased his flux energy by a large amount. His defense had also reached an unprecedented level. This was superimposed on the other formidable defense techniques and body tempering techniques which he had cultivated previously. Presently, Li Yunmyu was unable to even assess the grade of his defense. One thing, however, was certain, and that was that it was extremely powerful and firm. Regardless of whether it was simple physical defense or protective shield that blocked ethereal attacks, both of them had reached a new level. But this wasn't the most important part, since after integrating the three pieces of the Azure Dragon deity suit, Li Yunmu had gained complete control over Azure Dragon's deadly might with the help of the expert armor. This sort of deadly might was close to a source of deity-level energy, but Li Yunmu could now display it by relying on his expert armor. Furthermore, it wasn't a single-time use, but could be used normally. Azure Dragon. Li Yunmu made a fist toward the void of the heavenly world and launched a punch. The next instant, the Azure Flame Dragon spirit roared and came out. Its roar ascertained who was the most formidable creature in the world. But it wasn't alone. The next second, two serpent dragons, one red and one blue, rushed out from Li Yunmu's Azure Flame crystal armor. Although their strength couldn't compare to the Azure Dragon's sacred spirit, they were still extremely fierce. The two red and blue serpent dragons first joyously intermingled with each other, then the blue serpent dragon spiraled back and fell into Li Yunmu's left arm. At this time, a profound voice rose from the depths of Li Yunmu's mind. In the left arm resides the spirit of protection. The profound voice caused Li Yunmu to quiver. As he did so, the red serpent dragon spiraled back and fell into his right arm. The profound voice then echoed again. In the right arm resides the spirit of slaughter. Chapter 503 Descending into Black Spirit Valley. Bang! Bang! The two bangs echoed one after another, and Li Yunmu's originally Azure Flame crystal armor changed. Suddenly, a substantial change occurred in the Azure Flame crystal arms. In a blink, the two serpent dragons entrenched themselves in the crystal arms, and their bloody mouths extended from the fists. But the transformation wasn't complete yet. There was still the Azure Dragon spirit hovering around in the sky. It seemed to have sensed the provocation of the serpent dragons, and it also howled fiercely. Immediately, it drilled into Li Yunmu's Azure Dragon expert armor from the skies. Bang! A wave of formidable energy fluctuations spread through the surroundings. The next second, the entire crystal armor covering Li Yunmu's body began to undergo huge changes. The head of a mighty and imposing Azure Dragon began to form on his helmet. The crystal armor, which was originally covered with runes, golden threads, and silver stars, changed into deep Azure Dragon scales at that moment. And Li Yunmu could feel the whole transformation. At that instant, he knew that he'd become even more formidable. Transform for me, transform and allow me to enter Great Flux Expert Realm. When all the pieces were set, Li Yunmu moved all the energy in his body, and with the assistance of the final form of Azure Dragon Expert Armor, he began to improve his cultivation. He didn't face any sort of obstruction during this process. When Flux experts tried to break through to become Great Flux experts, the majority of them encountered various obstructions and bottlenecks. If they weren't successful the first time, they could only gather all the flux energy in their body and try again. If the second time was also unsuccessful, they would have to try for the third time, then the fourth, and maybe even more, until all the energy in their bodies had changed. Only then would they become Great Flux experts. However, Li Yunmu's strength was too great, too domineering. The so-called threshold for advancing his cultivation was like a tissue in front of his majestic strength. It was torn effortlessly the moment his strength rushed forth. Great Flux Expert Realm was finally achieved. From the beginning until then, 5 whole years had passed before Li Yunmu had entered the Great Flux Expert Realm. But he was different from other people. His starting line was so high that he couldn't even see the other cultivators, allowing him to stand at the peak of the world without any exception. The success of it all was inseparably linked to the foundation and resources Li Yunmu had collected over time. Otherwise, even if he had advanced his cultivation long ago, then at most, he would have become an ordinary elite and nothing more. How then could he have the qualifications to stand above the masses of the people in the boundless origin world and be able to reach the pinnacle? After his cultivation improved, Li Yunmu stood wearing Azure Dragon Expert Armor. He was at his peak state, but suddenly, he gazed at some distant point in the sky and asked, "Do I have the qualifications to return to Earth now?" "Yes." "Congratulations, host, you have truly matured," the system said with relief. Suddenly, an azure flame appeared in the sky in the daytime and fell downward like a meteor, bombarding the valley with extremely beautiful lights. "Who dares to intrude in my Black Spirit Valley?" The azure light illuminated the entire valley, and a squad of patrolling disciples immediately rushed to the scene. But soon, the leader of the patrolling squad was forced up by a beam of azure flame. Seeing this, the disciples in the vicinity who were rushing to provide assistance instantly stopped. They felt like they'd stepped into a quagmire, which made it difficult to move even one step forward. "It is a sage flux expert," one of them said with a dry throat after a gulp. Green light spread out, and from within it walked out a person wearing azure expert armor covered in scales. When the disciples of Black Spirit Valley saw that the expert armor was filled with scales and countless densely packed runes as well as emitted a terrifying presence, they didn't dare to rush indiscriminately into action. "This senior, I don't know what business do you have in Black Spirit Valley, so I request you to tell us your aim." Finally, a great flux expert rushed out from the depths of Black Spirit Valley and waved his hand, allowing the disciples in the distance to retreat. He then immediately clasped his hands in greeting. "Senior." The person with the azure flame expert armor covered in scales and a dragon-headed helmet spoke in an extremely young voice. He then directly said, "I have come to find someone. I would like to ask Senior, who is that person?" When the great flux expert of Black Spirit Valley heard the stranger's voice, he was extremely startled for a moment, but he didn't dare to be careless. "Zhan Huia," Li Yunmiu calmly said. It was a name of person whom he had viewed as a formidable opponent, someone who was supposed to strike fear in the hearts of people. But presently, Li Yunmiu was completely indifferent toward him. The person with that name was no longer that important to him. "Zhan Huia? I am sorry to say, but Senior, among the inner disciples of our Black Spirit Valley, there isn't anyone named Zhan Huia," the great flux expert replied with sincerity. "Oh, his real name is Zhan Huia, but among you, he has another name." "It should be Zhan Tian," Li Yunmiu said indifferently. When he mentioned Zhan Huia's other name in Black Spirit Valley, he smiled coldly. Regardless of whether it was Zhan Huia or Zhan Tian, the name sounded extremely domineering, but sadly the person wasn't like that. Actually, Li Yunmiu didn't know where after descending to such a formidable region filled with forest he got the self-confidence and arrogance to take an even more conspicuous name. But a person couldn't become more formidable just because of a name. Sure enough, as soon as Li Yunmiu mentioned Zhan Tian, the expression of the great flux expert immediately changed. "What? There still isn't any person with this name?" Li Yunmiu narrowed his eyes at the other party. The moment he did so, the great flux expert felt as if enormous pressure had fallen upon him, it forced him to retreat a few steps. The other disciples of Black Spirit Valley retreated even farther away. Sage flux experts. Who in the origin world didn't know about the might of sage flux experts? The great flux experts would never dare to offend the powerhouses of this layer. Even if someone was only watching from the surroundings, they might perish in a moment of carelessness because of the energy leaking out from the other party. However, the patrolling disciples as well as the upper echelons of Black Spirit Valley would have never expected that the person who had intruded into their Black Spirit Valley wasn't a sage flux expert. A just leveled up great flux expert was actually that daring. However, the presence emitted by Li Yunmiu, who was clad in Azure Dragon expert armor, was truly too terrifying. It far surpassed the strength possessed by great flux experts. Not to mention that the final form of his innate expert armor was extremely domineering and threatening. The people before him hadn't even seen a true innate expert armor personally, let alone one such as his. Chapter 504 Great Flux Expert? Garbage. Li Yunmiu saw through the other party's change in expression and asked with a cold smile, "What? Is there no person with such a name too?" Replying to Senior, there is really no person named Zhan Huiya in our Black Spirit Valley, neither is there someone named Zhan Tian. I think Senior has come to the wrong place. Although his expression had flickered for an instant upon hearing the name Zhan Tian, he forcefully calmed himself and refuted Qin Mu's claim. Good, very good, seems like Zhan Huiya has mixed in here pretty well, you didn't even hesitate to protect him. But since you won't hand him over, don't blame me for massacring your Black Spirit Valley. As a matter of fact, Li Yunmu hadn't expected for Zhan Huiya to be handed over from the start. Since the other party had chosen to occupy this corner with the power of a third-tier sect, they certainly had some confidence in being successful there. If it had been Li Yunmu of a few days ago, he wouldn't have possessed the qualifications to secretly infiltrate Black Spirit Valley, let alone raid it to capture the person he wanted. If he was discovered by the people of the sect, he would have definitely died. However, in the last couple days, Li Yunmu had congealed the innate expert armor which was extremely close to deity grade and advanced his realm to great flux expert. He wanted to use this matter of getting Zhan Huiya to provoke a battle so that he could test his strength. After all, even Li Yunmu himself didn't know how formidable he was. He needed a whetstone to sharpen his blade, and Black Spirit Valley was an exceptionally good candidate because it didn't have any deity tier powerhouses. Such beings didn't third-tier sects in the origin world. As long as no deities showed up, then given Li Yunmu's strength, he didn't need to fear sage flux experts. Black Spirit Valley, since you want to protect Zhan Huiya, let me see the reason for your confidence behind occupying this easternmost region. Take my punch. The next instant, Li Yunmu turned into an azure phantom. In a blink of an eye, he crossed several hundred meters. After appearing in front of the great flux expert, he landed a heavy punch on him. In his attack, Li Yunmu didn't use Azure Dragon Expert Armor's Azure Dragon Deadly Might, only the great flux expert's strength with his flux energy strength of 3,500 units. Bang! When Li Yunmu erupted with extremely fast speed and landed a mighty punch on the great flux expert, the man was knocked into the Black Spirit Valley's mountain, with his body damaged badly. It was just a single punch, but it was enough to blow away a great flux expert. The man was even left deeply entrenched in the mountain. This was the power of innate expert armor which was infinitely close to deity grade. From the beginning, Li Yunmu's flux energy strength had far surpassed that of ordinary Great Circle flux experts, reaching a terrifying value of 900 units. After the amplification provided by innate expert armor was counted in together with his cultivation which had advanced to the next realm, he could easily suppress other great flux experts. Whether it was the quality of the great flux energy or the strength of his attack, no one could match him. Also, because he had assimilated the wings of wind or because it was the special property of his innate expert armor, but Li Yunmu could now break through the normal convention of the origin world. This meant that even with a cultivation of great flux expert, he could fly even under the effect of the origin world's formidable gravity. Thus, the punch he unleashed just then not only contained great flux energy, but also the kinetic energy built up by rushing downwards from a high altitude. With one punch, the great flux expert who had already entered the third rank was instantly defeated. Weak, too weak. Is this the strength of a third-rank great flux expert? Can't even take one punch. Li Yunmu hadn't expected that a great flux expert who had entered third rank would turn out to be so weak after his strength had increased substantially. Don't go too far. Li Yunmu's words had thoroughly enraged the great flux expert who had been entrenched in the mountain crack, and an explosion echoed from there. The man had already leaped out of the crack. So you weren't a sage flux expert. But I have to admit that you are the most powerful great flux expert that I, Han Qingyun, have seen in my life. You should be proud of yourself for accomplishing this, but you shouldn't have intruded on my Black Spirit Valley. As the man who called himself Han Qingyun spoke while gnashing his teeth, his presence swelled, and he shouted loudly, "All the seniors and juniors, what are you still hiding and waiting for? We should act together to catch this thief." After Han Qingyun's words, a few powerful presences instantly arrived from the depths of Black Spirit Valley. Some were farther while others closer. Before the people even arrived, one of them already spoke. It was a melodious woman's voice. He, junior brother Han, didn't you consider yourself unparalleled on the same level? Yet you were forced to eat your words. A streak of silvery light flashed, and before her words were even finished, it flickered and rushed toward Li Yunmu with a hissing sound. Bang! The silvery light was extremely quick, to the point that the majority of disciples of Black Valley Spirit couldn't even see it. The attack slammed heavily against Li Yunmu, sending him to the ground. Humph! This flying great flux expert, what sort of tiger's skin is he hiding under? Eat my, Ling Kaiyan's, 7 rainbow godfish attack. You all, torture him until he begs. 4 great flux experts could be seen coming from afar. There were 3 men and 1 woman. Their group seemed to be the core disciples of Black Spirit Valley who had responded the earliest. However, when they saw Li Yunmu who had crashed into the ground earlier stand up and remove dust like nothing had happened, their eyes went wide. What sort of joke is this? You were speaking about some clownfish. Li Yunmu slowly walked out of the dust cloud while holding the still alive and struggling 7 rainbow fish in the bloody mouth of the blue serpent dragon on his arm. The next instant, a cruel smile appeared on Li Yunmu's face, and the flux energy moving through the blue serpent arm increased by a large amount. Instantly, the extremely beautiful 7 rainbow fish was melted by the magnificent great flux energy in front of the 5 people. Regardless of how much the 7 rainbow fish struggled, it wasn't able to resist in the slightest, nor could it slip away from the bloody teeth of the blue dragon head. Chapter 505 Crushing Black Spirit Valley. Silence. At that instant, regardless of whether it was Han Qingyun, who was boasting previously, Ling Qian, the other 3 great flux experts of Black Spirit Valley, or even the other disciples who had hidden far away in fear of bringing calamity onto themselves, all of their blood ran cold. Li Yunmu had neither evaded nor dodged, but eaten the attack of Ling Qian's 7 rainbow fish directly. He then used a single hand to crush it with his tyrannical great flux energy. The action had seemed extremely domineering and had cast a deep shadow over the onlookers' hearts, making them feel powerless. It has to be known that Ling Qian had obtained the 7 rainbow fish 2 years ago from the deep sea region after suffering unbelievable hardships. The fish was a vicious beast which possessed a special ancient bloodline. In the last 2 years, Ling Qian had spent countless heavenly treasures and her blood essence on it. Its strength had went up almost to the level of a genuine enormous beast. However, the 7 rainbow fish which possessed ancient bloodline was still unable to pose any resistance and was crushed by Li Yunmu. Oh, so this is the attack of a 4th-rank great flux expert? It doesn't seem all that powerful. Alright, since you're done with playing jokes, then let me send you all to hell. After 2 tests, Li Yunmu had obtained an understanding of his own strength. Although Han Qingyun was only a great flux expert of 3rd rank, he still had a bit of capital to boost his confidence. The great flux expert armor which he had congealed was actually the 3rd type, the treasure armor. Given the formidable flux energy amplification provided by it as well as its defense, he was unscathed and could even stand up on his own after being hit by Li Yunmu's first attack. But once Li Yunmu had understood the strength of the people around him, the next scene would be completely different. Eat my kick, Wind God. Li Yunmu's speed increased at that moment. A crack that spanned 100 meters opened in the ground from the place where he'd stamped his feet. His movement was far quicker compared to before, and he instantly appeared in front of Han Qingyun. He launched a heavy kick and unleashed the 36th form of Wind God Kick, sweeping him away. He didn't stack the 35 forms before it because there simply wasn't any need. The power of the final attack was more than enough. The final move of Wind God Tornado Kick was also the most powerful form which was the best at dealing fatal blows. When using it, Li Yunmu utilized 3000 units great flux energy, the power of 100 oxen, as well as the terrifying force of impact from his speed. That was why when Li Yunmu attacked again, Han Qingyun felt choked from the suppression caused by the kick. There couldn't even be any talking about fighting back against it. Boom, peng. Li Yunmu's kick seemed to have landed on a human-shaped tree. The enormous power and impact force as well as the terrifying great flux energy caused Han Qingyun's figure to explode on the spot. What formidable treasure armor in front of Li Yunmu's kick, it was only a balloon. Han Qingyun was dead. Ah! From the distance, waves of panic-filled shrieks could be heard. Although Han Qingyun's strength wasn't very high and he was only a third-rank Great Flux expert, he had been able to congeal a treasure armor. From this, it was clear that he received nurturing from Black Spirit Valley. When he exploded into pieces because of Li Yunmu's kick in front of everyone, pieces of his treasure armor and flesh scattered all over the ground. How could this be? He only used Great Flux energy, but it was way too terrifying. Ling Qian, who was the closest, looked lifelessly at the flesh of her junior brother Han splattered on the ground. Her face had already went colorless from fear. What grandeur of a Great Flux expert! Nothing like that existed in her at that moment. It was because the person who had intruded in their Black Spirit Valley was too formidable, just way too formidable. He clearly used only Great Flux energy, but he had crushed the 7 rainbow fish with a single hand and blown Han Qingyun into pieces with one kick. Great Flux experts were chickens in front of him who was a tiger on the hunt. The moment he pounced, a life was lost. Run quickly, junior sister, we will stop him. What are you standing there like a fool for? Run! One of the remaining 3 core disciples of Black Spirit Valley shouted out. It is too late to think about running. Once Li Yunmu had decided to kill, how could he show the slightest hint of pity? Since he had to capture Zhang Huiya and rescue Li Qinghong, it was foreordained that he would enter into conflict with Black Spirit Valley. From the instant he reached its territory, everyone was an enemy for whom he couldn't show any sort of kindness or pity. Bang! Li Yunmu's figure flickered again, and he transformed into an azure phantom that rushed to attack the remaining 3 core disciples of Black Spirit Valley. He no longer held back any of his strength, unleashing all of his Flux energy of 3,500 units as well as physical strength of 150 oxen. Boom, 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 boom. The Great Flux experts couldn't stop him even for a moment. After they crossed the path of Li Yunmu who was like a devil at that moment, they could only give up their lives in order to protect the life of junior sister Ling Qian. They were forced to perish in sadness. Their expressions after death were filled with profound remorse. It was because at the last moment, they had realized that the enemy in front of them wasn't a human but a devil. He was someone who possessed the cultivation of a Great Flux expert, but whose strength was much closer to that of Sage Flux experts. The trio had only congealed opulent expert armor, which was only second in the ranking, so they were helpless in front of Li Yunmu who had already released his killing intent. You still think you can run? Suddenly, Ling Qian who was still engrossed in the thoughts of running back to Black Spirit Valley heard a voice from ahead of her. She slowly lifted her head while shivering and looked at the mysterious youth who had blown Han Qingyun into pieces with one kick. The devil's body was covered by scaled armor which was emitting green flames. You won't have a good death. If my grandfather comes out of seclusion, he will certainly kill you ruthlessly. Oh, then before that, I must first get rid of his treasured granddaughter. A hint of coldness flashed past Li Yunmu's face, and he slowly extended his hands, easily catching the beautiful neck of Ling Qian. Ka-cha! The eyes of the young woman who had a melodious voice and flowery figure went lifeless. Weak, too weak. Clearly, Qian was a descendant of someone important in Black Spirit Valley. She was a Great Flux expert who had lots of treasures, but her heart was very weak. When she saw Li Yunmu kill Han Qingyun, her spirit broke. With ease, Li Yunmu twisted her neck, and the only outcome was that her precious life came to an end. After easily settling the resistance of the 5 Great Flux experts, Li Yunmu didn't pay any attention toward the hordes of disciples of Black Spirit Valley fleeing in disarray. He didn't care for anyone below Great Flux expert realm. Even if he was surrounded by them, they would pose no threat to him. Li Yunmu slowly closed his eyes and focused on his 5 senses. The next instant, his expression changed slightly. Sure enough, after personally entering Black Spirit Valley, he could already sense a weak connection to Li Qinghong. Black Spirit Valley might have been able to block his senses from thousands of kilometers away, but now that he was so close, the connection between them was like a lamp flickering in the darkness of the night. Li Yunmu temporarily renounced Zhanhua and looked in the direction of the depths of Black Spirit Valley. He immediately rushed there while passing panic-stricken disciples all along the way. They were dodging to the sides to avoid him at all costs. Absolute power, this was the absolute power which people standing at the top of the pyramid possessed. And in this region, Li Yunmu was now the one who possessed it. As for the numerous disciples, they were just fleeting clouds. Chapter 506, Azure Dragon Expert Armor's 3 Spirits. At that instant, Black Spirit Valley was like a completely defenseless woman wearing no clothes in front of Li Yunmu, whose strength had increased greatly. He could casually move around its territory without any problems. The dignity of Black Spirit Valley cannot be trampled. Among the hordes of disciples fleeing for their life, there were also some hot-blooded, brave youths. They roared and like moths attracted by a flame, they rushed to attack Li Yunmu, who was intruding upon their Black Spirit Valley. However, these people who didn't even possess the strength of Great Flux experts, how could they deal with Li Yunmu? When he looked at them, he considered them even inferior to ants. When Li Yunmu was bored, he would sometimes lower his head to look at the insects on the ground to pass the time, but he completely ignored the attacks of the hot-blooded youths. He kept walking at a speed which was neither fast nor slow in the direction in which he had sensed Li Qinghong. As for the people around him, the moment they came to 3-meter radius about Li Yunmu, they would be burned by the Azure Flame X from his Azure Dragon Expert Armor and collapse. Their corpses were intact, but their souls had been burned completely by the Azure Flame. No traces of them ever existing in this world remained. It was the dominance of every legendary innate expert armor, and Azure Dragon Expert Armor congealed by Li Yunmu was even better than most. Those under Great Flux Expert Realm shouldn't even think about attacking him without any protection for their soul. They didn't even possess the qualifications to come close to Li Yunmu. System, roughly what stage has my strength reached? While moving in the direction in which he sensed Li Qinghong, Li Yunmu posed a question for the system. During the battle moments ago, although he had defeated 5 core disciples of Black Spirit Valley, he still didn't know the exact limits of his strength. He could only hope that the system had analyzed and decided on a grade for his combat strength. Originally, he had wanted to use the opportunity to draw the Sage Flux experts of Black Spirit Valley and have a battle with them at his full strength. Even if it turned out that he wasn't an opponent for them, by relying on the tyrannical strength of innate expert armor as well as the absolute defense, he had the confidence of going in and out as he pleased. However, more than an hour had passed since he had entered Black Spirit Valley. There was something odd going on. It was quite strange that not even one Sage Flux expert was present in the main sect of Black Spirit Valley. Moreover, even the amount of Great Flux experts was exceptionally low. According to the regular conventions of a third-tier sects, a sect had to fulfill 3 conditions to be considered as one of them. The first was that the founders had to consist of 3 or more Sage Flux experts as well as at least 20 Great Flux experts to act as the backbone of the sect. This was a necessary condition which had to be fulfilled. Second, they had to occupy a non-disputable region which should be at least 1 million square kilometers. Third, they had to possess a cultivation method unique to their sect which could be considered as their inheritance. Given the 3 basic conditions needed to be fulfilled to be considered as third-tier sect, Black Spirit Valley's situation was quite strange. So far, he hadn't seen a single Sage Flux expert come to face him. But Li Yunmu didn't pay too much attention to it. His main priority right then was the rescue of Li Qinghong, the most promising follower under him. On the basis of the battle between Host and the 5 Great Flux experts, Host's strength is roughly equivalent to a 9th rank Great Flux expert, the system replied after remaining silent for a good while. During that time, it had performed some complicated calculations to find the exact level of Li Yunmu's combat strength. Really? Once Li Yunmu heard it, he began to palpitate. Although he had been somewhat mentally prepared, he was still extremely astonished when he heard the system's evaluation of his strength. The strength of Great Flux experts was divided into 10 ranks. With the rise in each rank, the increase in their Great Flux energy was roughly 300 units. When a Great Flux expert rose to the 10th rank, the increase in their flux energy was roughly equal to 3,000 units. But because Li Yunmu's flux energy was far higher than that of cultivators of the same level, as well as given the enormous amplification of his flux energy because of innate expert armor, his strength reached 3,500. After a series of calculations, just based on the comparison of Great Flux energy, he was deemed equivalent to a 9th rank Great Flux expert. However, Li Yunmu knew that the reason why Great Flux experts were known as Great Flux experts wasn't actually because they possessed Great Flux energy. Instead, it was because of their physical strength. In reality, Li Yunmu's physical strength was only 150 oxen, which was quite far from the physical strength of a genuine Great Flux expert of 9th rank. Because of that, based on his own evaluation, his present strength was equivalent to a Great Flux expert of 7th rank and not of higher 9th rank. Host, your calculation method is erroneous. You have forgotten about Azure Dragon Expert Armor's high-speed flying ability. With its extremely high speed, your power actually surpasses that of a 10th rank Great Flux expert. The system clearly understood what Li Yunmu was thinking and provided further explanation. Once Li Yunmu heard it, his heart stopped. That's right. He had indeed forgotten this fact. Ordinary Great Flux experts of the origin world couldn't fly because of the terrifying gravity. This was also the reason why in the beginning Han Qingyun had thought that he was a Sage Flux expert. But when they exchanged blows, he instantly discovered that the energy used by Li Yunmu was actually the energy used by Great Flux experts. So, how far behind am I, compared to a Sage Flux expert? Li Yunmu asked then. Mistake has been noticed. Based on the assessment done by the system regarding host's combat strength, if you also count the expert armor's special properties and defense as well as the strength of the shadows, then based on system's calculations, you have the qualifications to battle against a genuine Sage Flux expert. So formidable? That sounds impossible though. Li Yunmu was completely astonishing by the system's words. It is true. If you also count the spirits of slaughter and protection as well as the Azure Dragon Holy Spirit, you could definitely battle against a Sage Flux expert. Chapter 507, Demonic Black Spirit World. Then it should be. Li Yunmu thought about it and realized that the system hadn't gathered any data about the strength of Sage Flux experts. Because of that, its review was only a conjunction and not a certainty. But since the system had made this assessment, Li Yunmu's self-confidence increased. The spirits of protection and slaughter as well as the Azure Dragon Holy Spirit were the 3 special properties which had manifested in Azure Dragon Expert Armor. If he had congealed a treasure armor, then only one of them would have appeared, for certain. But from the time it was congealed, Li Yunmu's expert armor had displayed 3 innate properties. According to the system and his own guess, the Azure Dragon Holy Spirit, which was the core, had actually appeared from the 3 parts of Azure Dragon deity suit. According to the system's speculations, after the 50 million ability points were added with the Snake Goddess scale, it caused the Blue Serpent Dragon Spirit to appear. Its ability was the same as what its name said, mainly protection of Li Yunmu. Earlied, he hadn't even needed to move to catch Ling Kaiyan's 7 rainbow fish. At that time, he had actually used the protection spirit which resided in his left arm to defend against the attack of an extremely penetrating nature. The opponent's 7 rainbow fish fatal move didn't even have the opportunity to come in contact with Azure Dragon Expert Armor's or Li Yunmu's personal defense before it was stopped by the spirit of protection. The main ability of this serpent dragon in his left hand was to defend the master. It also could become more formidable with battles, that is, if Li Yunmu was always in combat. Unless the enemy thoroughly broke through the shield of spirit of protection, it would automatically absorb a part of energy from the attack and transform it into its own, thus strengthening the shield. Simply speaking, the more the spirit of protection was attacked, the more powerful its shield would become. As it continued to absorb the power of enemy attacks, the more its strength would increase. It could go up to an extremely terrifying degree. This was a formidable ability of Spirit of Protection which had formed from 50 million ability points as foundation and the addition of Snake Goddess Scale. There was also Li Yunmu's right hand which held the Spirit of Slaughter. It possessed the ability to grow stronger with battle as well. It was mainly formed from the 50 million experience points added with Snake Goddess Scale. The more lives were taken and the more formidable life forms killed, the more powerful would become the effect of Spirit of Slaughter. Although the 4th and 5th rank core disciples of Black Spirit which he had faced recently were great Flux experts, they were still not powerful enough to make Li Yunmu use his Spirit of Slaughter. As for the Azure Dragon Holy Spirit, it was even more important. Most likely, the reason why the system had the assurance that Li Yunmu could battle against a Sage Flux expert was because of it. As long as he possessed the Azure Dragon Holy Spirit, Li Yunmu would have a power source which could produce an energy which was extremely close to deity level. Although the amount of Azure Dragon deadly might he could draw from it wasn't enormous, it was sufficient to resist the terrifying might of Sage Flux experts. Apart from this, Li Yunmu's Azure Dragon Expert Armor also possessed another innate ability which hadn't completely formed yet. It was the special power of World Ancestors Seed. After dropping the 5 drops of leaf juice on the seed, it had germinated, but it was only a sprout and had yet to grow into a sapling. Because of that, Li Yunmu's Expert Armor only possessed 3 special abilities, namely Spirit of Protection, Spirit of Slaughter, and Azure Dragon Holy Spirit. As for the other treasures used in refining, like Wings of Wines and Black Ghost King Armor, they clearly didn't cross the required threshold. Due to that, they didn't manifest any special properties, but even so, after the Wings of Wind were assimilated into innate expert armor, Li Yunmu had obtained the ability to fly with the cultivation of Great Flux Expert. As for any ability manifested from assimilation of Black Ghost King armor, Li Yunmu had yet to see one. However, here was a high likeliness that it would be triggered under special circumstances. All the properties mentioned above were the most terrifying aspects of innate expert armor congealed by Li Yunmu which had increased his strength greatly. If his own defense was also counted into the mix with it, then neither he nor the system would be able to guess his actual combat strength. Because of that, it could only be determined after he faced off against a Sage Flux expert. Although Li Yunmu's main goal was to rescue Li Qinghong, he also wanted to use the 3rd-tier sect Black Spirit Valley to see the extent of his combat strength after the great increase. But unfortunately, he had counted his chickens before they had hatched and now had nothing. Black Spirit Valley was extremely strange. The entire upper echelon as well as all the core disciples had disappeared without a trace. Even though he had intruded in the sect's territory, no action had been taken against him. Ah, here it is. Black Spirit World's steel? So this is the case. They've been holding Li Qinghong under this steel, so no wonder I couldn't sense her from 1,000 kilometers away. After Li Yunmu finished his monologue, he stepped into the Black Spirit World. After the 5 drops of World Ancestors juice had blended into his Azure Dragon Expert Armor, the so-called Black Spirit World which was just another dimensional space couldn't be hidden from his eyes and other senses. Once he stepped into the Black Spirit World, his surroundings immediately changed. The sky wasn't blue and bright anymore, but had become completely dark and gloomy. In the Black Spirit World, rain kept falling incessantly, but it was also black. Just as the name suggested, the place was dark and gloomy. Such intense demonic energy. Li Yunmu's brows wrinkled slightly, for the black rain was filled with demonic energy. It was strange, extremely strange. The sect had provided shelter to Zhanhua and didn't give him up easily. They also occupied the territory of a 3rd-tier sect at such a place, so it definitely wasn't an ordinary third-tier sect. At that instant, Li Yunmu had confirmed this. So? Did they do anything to you? Li Yunmu walked another few steps forward to achieve his first target for intruding upon Black Spirit Valley, rescuing Li Qinghong. The kidnapped woman was tied to the Black Spirit Boundary Stone. They were using its power to suppress the connection between master and follower. But, it was completely useless by then. Li Yunmu used his hand as a blade and released a wave of great flux energy in the form of a sword. It went in the direction of the boundary stone, removing the bindings off Li Qinghong, who had been tied to it. Chapter 508, Origin of the Demonic Filth. Are you all right? They haven't done anything to you, right? Li Yunmu walked forward and chopped off the formless restrictions binding Li Qinghong to the boundary stone, allowing her to regain her freedom. I'm all right. They had other matters to attend to and didn't have any spare time to deal with me. A hint of bitterness appeared on her cold and elegant face. She lightly moved her muscles while speaking. The two of them weren't sentimental people. Li Qinghong didn't inquire much as to where had he disappeared for the past time or how had he entered the Black Spirit world. And Li Yunmu also didn't blame Li Qinghong for having overestimated her abilities. There were some matters in the world which even if people knew they couldn't deal with, they could only harden their resolve and try anyway. Clearly, Li Qinghong was this type of person. Underworld Serpent had provided some of the details about Zhang Wei's situation long ago. And regardless if it was Li Qinghong or Li Yunmu himself, both of them could make a guess that it was highly probable that Zhang Wei would be able to open a passage to Earth in the near future. Because of that, after Li Yunmu disappeared in the Origin God world and lost all contact with them, Li Qinghong stood up to take the responsibility of dealing with Zhang Wei's matter. Li Yunmu provided her with some power grain and water while anxiously asking, "What's their progress?" "When I infiltrated them more than 10 days ago, they had progressed to a crucial stage. As for whether they have already succeeded or not, I can't tell. All of them are presently in the depths of the Black Spirit world. These days, the sounds of activity coming from there have become a lot quieter." Li Qinghong quickly narrated all she knew. "Then let's go, follow me." Once Li Yunmu heard her words, his blood went cold. He glanced toward the depths of the Black Spirit world and rushed there with quick steps, not daring to delay. "Master!" Li Qinghong blindly followed him, but she still called him with some hesitation. "What? The strength of this Black Spirit Valley is more formidable compared to what you may think. They have at least 5 old monsters here." Li Qinghong brought Li Yunmu's attention to an important fact. Once he heard it, his steps faltered. He instantly understood why Black Spirit Valley hadn't shown any strength on the outside, why the amount of great flux experts outside was so low. It was all so they could proceed with the matter at hand with great speed. Zhang Wei truly was bold. In order to open the passage to Earth in advance, he didn't hesitate to reveal the secret of his origin to this sect. Such behavior was equivalent to showing a wolf into one's house. It was no wonder then that he had obtained such an important position in Black Spirit Valley and had figured a way to open a passage to return to Earth so quickly. Everything was because he was using someone else's might. At this instant, Li Yunmu was extremely furious. Such people who betrayed their whole world to accomplish their goals without even caring for consequences needed to be exterminated straight away. The 5 monsters which Li Qinghong had mentioned were undoubtedly 5 sage flux experts of Black Spirit Valley. This sort of power would be considered as terrifying among third-tier powers. Moreover, it seemed like the demonic Black Spirit world was even more complicated than he'd thought. It was hard to guess how many lives the third-tier power which occupied a corner of the Origin world controlled to fill this up the demonic Black Spirit world. Li Yunmu didn't know whether he could hold his own against 5 sage flux experts with his present strength, but he had no other option. However, after entering the Black Spirit world, a new ability had awakened, which put his mind at ease. It was the ability of the Black Ghost King armor which he had assimilated into his innate expert armor. After entering the demonic plane, it had been triggered. Such an ability really put his heart at ease. After thinking about it for a moment, Li Yunmu didn't hesitate anymore. He caught Li Qinghong in his arms and unleashed all his great flux energy strength of 3,500 units. The next instant, his figure became a sharp arrow that shot through the demonic rain. So fast, Master, your strength. Li Qinghong, who was the closest to Li Yunmu, was the person who experienced the large increase in Li Yunmu's strength most clearly. When he unleashed his great flux energy, the energy at the soles of his feet were like rockets propelling him forward at an extremely fast speed, which left Li Qinghong astonished. "Oh, I've cultivated to the Great Circle," Li Yunmu calmly replied while carrying Li Qinghong at an exceptionally fast speed. "What? You cultivated the final chest, abdomen, and navel star points too?" Only after receiving a positive reply from Li Yunmu did she start to believe it. Even if she was an extremely proud and powerful woman who would have never acknowledged anyone before, a hint of acceptance took root in her mind after witnessing the miracles created by Li Yunmu. She had successfully become an important disciple of Green Goblin Mountain, and yet she had barely obtained the cultivation method of the chest C point. Li Yunmu, who had disappeared for the past 3 months, however, had already cultivated the final 3 points and advanced his cultivation. Li Qinghong couldn't even imagine how had he accomplished such speed and efficiency. "Then Master, what level of expert armor have you congealed?" Although it was the first time a hint of acknowledgement entered her mind, she was still unwilling to give up. "Treasure armor." Originally, Li Qinghong wanted to guess that it was opulent expert armor, but when she noticed the dominance of Li Yunmu's Azure Flame expert armor covered in dragon scales, she couldn't help but raise her assessment by a level. "Wrong. If it had been treasure congealed expert armor, I probably wouldn't have possessed the qualifications to make my way into Black Spirit Valley today," Li Yunmu said with a faint mocking smile. He wasn't being unduly humble. In truth, if he hadn't been given World Ancestors seed by that crazy Yuan Biao before leaving the Origin God world, then he would have definitely followed the original plan and obediently congealed a treasure armor. However, if he had congealed treasure armor, then given the flux energy amplification of 50% to 100%, his flux energy strength wouldn't have reached what he could use at that moment. With that strength, even defeating Han Qingyun, who had congealed a treasure armor, would have been a difficult task, let alone dealing with Ling Kaiyan and the other 4 great flux experts who had joined hands to face him. There would have been no killing his way into the forbidden region of Black Spirit Valley, the Black Spirit World, either. "Is it the legendary innate expert armor?" Li Qinghong sucked in a cold breath. "That's right, it's innate expert armor. This is the biggest reason behind your rescue today," Li Yunmu said without much thought behind it. Strength didn't represent everything, and it also didn't solve all troubles. But it could lessen the amount of inconveniences one faced. It could also make sure that people wouldn't dare to find trouble with the person. This was how the Origin world worked. "Quick, the central region of the Black Spirit world is ahead of us. When I came here before, I was discovered and captured by them." Even though Li Qinghong was stunned at the news of her master congealing the legendary innate expert armor, she was still paying attention to their surroundings. Chapter 509, They are at my place. Suddenly, a loud wail echoed from far away, which caused Li Qinghong's body to start trembling. She instantly recalled a scene from half a month ago and immediately forgot about the issue of the innate expert armor being real or fake. Her complexion changed, and she was about to warn Li Yunmu. But it was too late. Li Yunmu narrowed his eyes and halted his movements immediately. In front of him, the demonic energy grew even more rich, just one step short of materializing. Most of it was concentrated in the forest in front of him. Far away, some black shadows gradually appeared in the forest filled with demonic energy. 1, 2, 3, 10, 100, several hundred, several thousands, and even more. All of a sudden, Li Yunmu and Li Qinghong were besieged by countless enemies. Their numbers were indeed impossible to count. This region is the source of the demonic energy, but when I infiltrated it, only several tens of such demonic figures appeared. How can there be so many all of a sudden? Li Qinghong involuntarily cried out. She couldn't control her shivering. After all was said and done, she was still a woman. Regardless of how formidable was her strength or how staunch her willpower, when she confronted the strange demonic creatures, she still felt extreme loathing towards them and the desire to resist. It was all due to her base instincts. When she had been captured alive by those 20-30 demonic creatures before, they had wanted to peel off her clothes and occupy her, thoroughly dirtying her body and spirit. If not for an elder of Black Spirit Valley who had arrived at that time and loudly commanded that she was to be tied to the steel so that her fate could be decided later, she didn't even dare to imagine what would have happened to her. Although the matter had happened half a year ago, she didn't mention a single word of it in front of Li Yunmu. Yet when she saw them again, she still felt a shiver run down her spine. Very simple, because they already know that I've charged into their territory. Li Yunmu's attention was completely focused on the demonic creatures of the Black Spirit world, to the extent that he didn't notice Li Qinghong's reaction. Seems like they have dispatched all the demonic creatures this time. I'm afraid that their plan has already entered the most crucial stage, so not even a single sage Flux expert can be spared. But, if they naively believe that by relying on these demonic creatures, they could stop my, Li Yunmu's steps, they are gravely underestimating me. It wasn't that Li Yunmu was being arrogant, but that he didn't fear the attacks of lower demonic life forms. Regardless of whether it was his absolute defense or his 11 shadows, he didn't fear being attacked from all sides by weak things. It wouldn't matter even if he was surrounded by several thousands or even tens of thousands of such demonic creatures. He glanced at the densely packed crowd and asked the system to scan his surroundings. It relayed that the strength of the majority of the creatures based on their presences was between 150 to 180 points. If he was some ordinary Flux expert with strength equivalent to that of Li Qinghong, then even if 100 of them entered this region, they definitely wouldn't be able to leave. The strength of 150 to 180 was already equivalent to high-level Flux experts. Many of them were extremely close to the upper limit of 180 points of Flux energy strength of the majority of Flux experts. If the special and unique attacks of these demonic creatures were also factored in, then it wasn't that surprising that Li Qinghong would have been captured by some 20-30 of them. Apart from the majority of the demonic creatures who possessed the strength ranging from the high level to Great Circle Flux experts, there were still several hundred who were more formidable. The demonic energy emitted from their bodies was stronger and had already reached the point of materialization. He could sense it from afar. The strength of these more formidable demonic creatures had already surpassed the Flux expert realm and was comparable to that of great Flux experts. Based on their energy fluctuations, the majority of them had the Flux energy strength of 500 or higher. The higher ones even reached 700. After the scan, Li Yunmu finally understood what sort of capital the third-tier power which occupied one corner of the world possessed. An ordinary third-tier sect could never possess tens of thousands of high-level or even Great Circle Flux experts. Even if the disciples of Black Spirit Valley weren't counted and only the power concealed in the Black Spirit world was considered, it would be enough to show the sect's dominance. After all, it also possessed more than 100 more formidable demonic creatures whose strength was equivalent to great Flux experts. However, all of this was completely useless in front of Li Yunmu. Although they possessed higher numbers, they wouldn't be able to break his defense or go through his shield. And he also still possessed the Azure Dragon expert armor now. My shadows, exterminate them. Li Yunmu fully understood that since not one sage expert had shown up, it was certain that they were at the most crucial stage. The time which he had set aside for destroying their plan was not sufficient anymore. Thus, he had no other methods. Without talking any nonsense, he waved his hand, and the first 10 shadows were summoned. Li Yun, Li Feng, Li Tian, Li Dai, Li Mei, Li Lan and the others appeared and charged toward the surrounding demonic creatures whose numbers still seemed to be increasing. The dark shapes were filled with killing intent. Given Li Yunmu's increase in strength, it was clear that his shadows would have become even more formidable. Not only did they possess the cultivation methods and deadly tricks practiced by Li Yunmu, they also had the absolute defense of the same layer. It wouldn't be the slightest exaggeration to say that if not for the innate expert armor, which far surpassed the synchronizing ability of the shadows, Li Yunmu would even be able to ignore Sage Flux experts. Although Li Yun and the others didn't have Li Yunmu's innate expert armor and didn't possess its special abilities, they had also followed their master and risen to great Flux expert realm. Their strength had also undergone substantial increase. At the very least, each of the shadows possessed 900 great Flux strength, the same as Li Yunmu. Thus, each of them had the strength to easily deal with ordinary great Flux experts. After all, they also possessed the results of Li Yunmu practicing the formidable body tempering techniques. In the first moment of confrontation, the shadows chopped down a large number of the demonic creatures. As for the special attacks of the demonic creatures, they were completely useless on Li Yun and the others. They would have been effective if Li Yun and the others were ordinary human cultivators and could be corroded by the demonic energy, but unfortunately, Li Yun and the others weren't human. They originated from shadow life forms and thus weren't influenced by the attacks of demonic energy. What added to the despair of the demonic creatures was that their ability to remain undying had suddenly disappeared in front of Li Yunmu. How is that even possible? Why aren't they resurrecting? Something is fishy here. This is the region where the demonic energy of the black spirit world originates, so why aren't they resurrecting? Deep in the forest, a man was panicking at that moment. That was because he had discovered that there was something wrong with the situation outside. After being killed by the 11 shadows summoned by the enemy, the demonic creatures under his control didn't resurrect, which should have happened under ordinary circumstances. The forest was the region where the demonic energy of the black spirit world originated. As long as it didn't disappear, the demonic creatures would continue to resurrect again and again. But for some reason, they were completely obliterated as soon as they died. Are you talking about them? It's not that they cannot be resurrected, but that the region where they are resurrected isn't here anymore. Suddenly, Li Yunmu appeared by the side of the person who'd just been talking to himself. He raised a finger and pointed toward the breastplate of his Azure Dragon expert armor. Even Li Yunmu hadn't thought that the special environment required to trigger the effect of the Black Ghost King armor which he had assimilated into his innate expert armor would be this forest. One of the effects of that ability was to collect the souls of all dead creatures. Chapter 510, Sinister Sacrificial Offerings. Impossible. This region in our black spirit world is a place from which demonic energy originates. How could you possibly reverse the resurrection of the creatures born from this demonic filth? The core disciple of Black Spirit Valley was still unable to accept the truth. He was holding a banner in his shaking hand. It seemed like it was the treasure used to control all the creatures formed by the demonic energy. Li Yunmu revealed a cold smile while arrogantly looking down on him. With one hand, he seized the treasure and threw it on the ground before stomping on it with all of his great flux energy strength of 3,500. Under the impact of the terrifying flux energy, the treasure, which had been refined after careful planning and at a large expense by Black Spirit Valley, was ruthlessly crushed into fragments. Nothing is impossible. Oh, seems like you still don't understand? Then I think you should go and have a long chat with them. Suddenly, Li Yunmu's hand shot toward the opponent's belly. Even if the man was clad in strong great flux expert armor, he still couldn't resist the attack. Li Yunmu's punch blew away all the thoughts in the enemy's mind about transmitting what had happened to his superiors, shattering his delusional hopes. The man had been quite crafty. He had hoped to use other objects against Li Yunmu while taking the opportunity to secretly inform the upper echelon of Black Spirit Valley about what had transpired in the forest. But even his smallest movements couldn't escape Li Yunmu's true sight. Li Yunmu had assimilated 5 drops of World Ancestors leaf juice while congealing his innate expert armor. Because of that, no movements or energy fluctuations coming from the enemy could escape his attention. The punch was enough to crush all of the man's defenses and his ability to resist. Like picking up a chicken, Li Yunmu ruthlessly grabbed the other party who possessed the strength of at least a rank 5 great flux expert and threw him into a dense group of demonic creatures like he was trash. After he was thrown into the group of demonic creatures who were waiting like sharks, desperate, blood-curdling shrieks could be heard. From the moment Li Yunmu crushed the treasure which controlled the demonic creatures, they had went out of control. This was a situation which Li Yunmu was more than willing to witness. After all, the demonic creatures had been nourished in the black spirit world for countless years. Although the 10 shadows possessed extraordinary battle prowess, the enemy numbers were just too great. Once they were no longer under human control, they stopped acting like an organized unit, and the shadows found it easy to attack and retreat without incurring damage. Let's go. My summoned creatures will handle this situation here, Li Yunmu said while playing it down, having decided to rescue Li Qinghong from her desperate predicament. He quickly walked out of the forest, leaving behind the stupefied woman. Tyrannical, extremely tyrannical. At that moment, Li Qinghong had personally experienced Li Yunmu's transformation. She had never ever expected that once his cultivation advanced to the next realm, his strength would give her such a great pressure that she hadn't sensed even from a great flux expert who had been in this realm for several years. Could it be because of the legendary innate expert armor? Is it really so terrifying? Thinking about it, Li Qinghong shook her head with a bitter smile. At that instant, she was feeling powerless. She felt that she would never be able to surpass Li Yunmu. Although she'd had no choice but to become his follower all that time ago, but in the deepest parts of her heart, she had still not been convinced. She had counted her days in hopes of overtaking Li Yunmu and prevailing over him in combat. But at that moment, she realized that her target was too far away. She recalled Li Yunmu's words from that time when he had told all his followers that on the day when any of them stepped into the Sage Flux expert realm, he would unconditionally return their freedom to that person. Now it was clear that the words which she had considered as empty talk weren't actually false, but rather a genuine promise. Given the present situation, it was obvious that on the day when any of the followers stepped into the Sage realm, Li Yunmu would possess enough strength so that he wouldn't need to care about his secrets being revealed. After the issue of the demonic energy of the black spirit world was settled, the path forward didn't have any more obstructions. Soon, they arrived at the depths of the forest which was viewed as the core region of the black spirit world. From far away, one could see an extremely enormous jade altar with a flight of steps erected at the center. Zhan Huia, whom Li Yunmu was trying to find since the start, was present there. Except for him, there was also an elder and valley master as well as all the other core disciples. At this moment, they were at the most crucial junction of finishing an extremely important matter. All these people surrounding the altar above the platform were pouring in their flux energy with rapt attention. A large amount of sacrifices were also arranged on top of the altar. What left Li Yunmu most astonished was that the surroundings of the altar were filled with 3 rows of young girls. They were aged between 15 to 18 years old and didn't have a single thread covering their bodies while they were tied to stakes inserted in the ground. Their snow-white, naked bodies were covered in some extremely strange spell markings. One after another, drops of blood flowed down their bodies and fell onto the black ground next to the stakes. The blood then flowed toward the altar at the center through a large demonic spell formation which had been arranged on the ground a long time ago. With one glance, Li Yunmu knew that the girls were beyond saving. After losing a large amount of blood, they were on their last breaths. He truly hadn't expected that a trifling third-tier power occupying a corner of the world would surprisingly use a sinister move of utilizing 1,000 young girls as their offerings. Li Yunmu didn't become angry. On the contrary, he remained quite calm. This was because there was an unsurpassable disparity between the cultivators and ordinary people in the origin world. In it, there was nothing which was fair or unfair. If someone wanted justice, they had to rely on their own fists to deliver it. But the scene still hardened Li Yunmu's resolve to eliminate Black Spirit Valley in one stroke. Another fact which surprised him was that the sacrificial methods used by Black Spirit Valley to open a passage to Earth were clearly different from the Heavenly Path platform obtained by him. If he wanted to open a passage to some plane, he needed to fulfill only 2 requirements to accomplish it. The first requirement was that he had to be aware of the coordinates of that world. The second requirement was that he had to provide enough dimensional stones to draw a heavenly bridge to that plane. Although accomplishing the above 2 conditions wasn't that simple since he needed to offer large amounts of dimensional stones, but all of it appeared to be an ordinary transaction. However, the method used in the Black Spirit world was very different. Compared to Li Yunmu's extremely ordinary offering, the method of the upper echelon of Black Spirit Valley were similar to sacrifices demanded by a demonic spirit. In reality, the sacrificial altar even resembled a human-built pagoda. Could it be that they aren't using a treasure similar to the heavenly platform to open a passage to Earth, but are really offering sacrifices to an evil spirit to obtain a large amount of energy?